In The Postmodern Condition, published in 1979, the philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard wrote, "Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodernism as incredulity towards metanarratives." So what is a metanarrative? There are three good examples. The most obvious is the religious narrative about why we're on Earth, what we should do while we're here, and what will happen in the future. The second is a narrative like Marxism, which makes similar observations and predictions about questions like why we act in the ways we do and what the consequences of those actions will be. The third is the narrative of Homo economicus, the story of the perfectly rational, self-interested individual, with the natural right to be free from interference. Modernization theory is the story of capitalism bringing all out of poverty and producing a gradual decline in inequality. What metanarratives have in common is their claim to apply to all people at all times, to be universal, natural, structural. Postmodernity is, as Lyotard wrote, an incredulity towards these grand stories, an acceptance that the world is much more complicated, in flux, heterogeneous. The defenders of individualism or liberalism might claim that this isn't a metanarrative at all, that capitalistic self-interest is the natural state of man, and our institutions simply reflect that, while many postmodern thinkers argue that this itself is a narrative we've created. Postmodernists and individualists have something in common though. They both think that each person has a singular perspective on the world, that any larger claim to a truth that transcends all people is outdated, indefensible. Universal or transcendent beliefs would theoretically apply to everyone. They'd stretch out across the globe in space, but also in time. And the decline in these beliefs means a proliferation of different positions. We're living in what historian Daniel Rogers calls the age of fracture. As we've lost the ability to construct stories about the future, we've succumbed to short-termism. We only think about the next day, the next week, the next few years. And this lack of long-term belief materializes everywhere. Politicians focus on monthly figures of inflation, GDP and unemployment, the next election. Business focuses on quarterly returns, stockholder value. Even in universities, academics have focused on shorter and shorter time periods, more specialized topics and more focused research. BlackRock chairman Lawrence Fink wrote in a letter to Fortune 500 CEOs that it concerns us that in the wake of the financial crisis, many companies have shied away from investing in the future growth of their companies. Too many companies have cut capital expenditure and even increased debt to boost dividends and increase share buybacks. When done for the wrong reasons and at the expense of capital investment, it can jeopardize a company's ability to generate sustainable long-term returns. The majority of major companies like IBM, Microsoft, Pepsi, etc. return almost all of their profits to shareholders to keep stock prices high, rather than focusing on long-term investment. Even though the evidence is that, not surprisingly, investment in research and development leads to long-term growth. In politics, issues like education or infrastructure get little focus because the payoffs from investment take years to materialize. In 2017, for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers reported that 56,000 bridges in the US were structurally deficient. That's almost 10%. Party membership has also declined. Political parties are, in the abstract, groups of people organising themselves to pursue a future goal. The lack of any long-term political ideas, a staple of leftist political thought since Marx at least, mean that spaces where long-term ideas are discussed have shrunk or disappeared completely. Instead, politics is about slick leaders and the 24-hour news cycle, winning the debate in the moment. There are two obvious and impending consequences of all of this. Short-termism has left us globally ill-prepared for thinking about and solving both climate change and global and national inequality. When we lose the ability to tell long-term stories, we lose the spaces, physically and abstractly, to think about them. Philosopher William Galston writes that collective myopia is the core disease of our time. In the History Manifesto, available for free in the link below, Joe Guldi and David Armitage argue that universities, and especially historians, have a unique position to create long-term narratives about the world. Historians, as with most academics, have too been increasingly focused on the short term. In 1900, the average history dissertation covered 75 years. In 1975, that had shrunk to 30 years. Historians have been focusing on smaller and smaller issues in shorter and shorter timeframes. Guldi and Armitage, though, argue for a return to what French historians of the Annales School called the longue duree. It's inspired by Fernand Braudel's pioneering study of the Mediterranean during the 16th century. For Braudel, human history was structured by three intersecting time spans: the longue duree of the physical environment, rock formations and rivers, the mid-level and gently paced histories of states or civilizations, and finally the history of events that were like froth on the crests of much larger waves. Braudel thought that all three needed to be considered by the historian to get a picture of why something happened when and as it did. The History Manifesto encourages a return to this kind of history, a history that can look at long-term causes and effects and can help us think about phenomena like global warming and global inequality. To take one of their examples, they point to how Thomas Piketty used evidence from the past 200 years to prove that the long-accepted Kuznets theory that inequality was slowly reduced by capitalism was mistaken. Kuznets' data was from only a few decades since World War II, which Piketty shows was an anomaly. What is much more likely, judging from historic trends, is a return to the kind of inequality and rentier economy of the past. In other words, inequality is common under capitalism. The History Manifesto also argues that the current revolution in big data and the new and innovative ways computers can parse data means that we can look at archives in ways not possible in the past. The transatlantic slave trade database, for example, has entries on some 35,000 slave voyages that can be investigated in thousands of different innovative ways. Historians, they argue, are particularly suited to weighing up data from lots of disciplines, economic, legal, scientific, political, etc., thinking about causation and translating that data into a digestible narrative. I think what's important is to create spaces for long-term discussions. On the London School of Economics blog, Ian Marsh argues, for example, that select committees are, and were especially during the 19th century, a place where all parties could come together with selected members of the public to create a forum for dialogue, for thinking about long-term policy. National planning committees in India and China both look towards long-term planning, and we need to hold successor governments to laws and treaties for a certain period once they've been passed. What's important is making these spaces visible so that we can encourage debate about long-term thought that can then spread. The postmodern fear of grand narratives is that they become structural, present themselves as eternal, universal, rigid. This sort of narrative can lead to an abuse of power by those that think they are serving some universal truth. The Kings, the Stalins, the Hitlers, the religious fundamentalists of the world have always justified their actions by claiming to be the servants of some higher truth. So we need to heed these warnings while thinking about opening spaces for narratives about the future that don't claim to be the only truth. We need plenty of different futures. We need to propose big ideas and lively debate. Historian Libby Robin writes that the future is no longer destined. Rather, it is something we create. If so, we need to engage all possible creativity in making that future: science, economics, history, and the human imagination. No one can predict the future, but imagination can illuminate its relationship to history and the present conditions of the world. If you like these videos and want to support Then and Now, then here's my request. If you think you get as much value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 towards the creation of each new video on Patreon, where you can even limit your pledge to just $1 per month. If you subscribe below, then please make sure to hit that bell to make sure you get alerted to new videos, and you can follow me on Twitter and Facebook in the links in the description below. Thanks to all my existing Patreons, and see